lifetime resident of this town, and I've had family living in this town since 1852 when Michael Kiefer moved here, who was a Civil War soldier that Bob Williams is related to and writes about a lot. And my great-grandmother was Michael Kiefer's daughter, and her daughter, Emma May Barnmore, married William Wickham, who moved to Verona in 1898 from Port Jervis, New York. And her daughter, my father was born in 1910 in the Flatiron Building at the corner of Fairview Avenue and Pine and Bloomfield Avenue. And here I am. I've lived in Verona almost all my life, except for a couple of years when I got married.
Well, I started out in East Orange Homeopathic Hospital, and 10 days later they brought me home, and I'm still in Verona, in the same house that my dad built in 1924. So we're still Veronaites all the way, and I also spent 28 years there working in the town hall. Started out as a water billing clerk and wound up 28 years later as the assistant tax collector and retired.
I started out working in Bloomfield when I lost my job. In 1983, I started working for the Board of Education as a custodian at Henry B. Whitehorn High School. Then 2 years later, 1985, I moved to Forest Avenue School as the head custodian, and 8 years later, I moved back to H.B. Whitehorn, and the last 4 years, I worked as the head custodian at H.B. Whitehorn and retired this past August.
That's called following in your father's footsteps.
And that's called following in my footsteps because my dad worked for the Verona Board of Ed from about 1944 until 1952. And he, again, we both started basically in the same way. He started at Henry B. Whitehorn High School at that time, moved on to Forest Avenue School before he left the Board of Education for another job.
My dad started out in 1930 at the F.M. Brown School as the custodian. His one story was he never got beyond 6th grade because he retired in 1962 after, I don't know, some 30-odd years with the Board of Education.
And then I also went to F.M. Brown School, and I remember Louise's father. And things, like Louise said, were very different back in Verona at that time. In the 40s, during the time of the Second World War, Verona probably only had about 8,000 people in it. We had two farms in Verona. We had Jacobus's farm on Grove Avenue and Jennings' farm, which basically was around F.M. Brown School.
That's very interesting, yes. But if you want to take a quick walk up Bloomfield Avenue, as I remember it, many, many moons ago, where Steve Janet's office is now, used to be Smith Line's drugstore. And then from there, if you walked across the street on the corner, was Shine Bloom's department store. Next to Shine Bloom's was Ace Hochstein hardware store. Mm-hmm. And then Amsterdam's Meat Market. And then next to that was Mrs. Ya. It was Richter's Bake Shop, the best baked goods in town. And then above that, at one time, there was a place called Hoffman's Dry Goods Store. And I don't know whether Terry's was still there at that time. Well, I don't think Terry's was in there at this time.
No, I don't think so.
And then on up to where the middle school used to be. And then you got up on the other side of Bloomfield Avenue here. Once in a while, I was allowed to walk up the avenue. And Farley's 5 and 10.
I remember Farley's 5 and 10, Mrs. Farley, yeah. Who, by the way, was a secretary up in Forest Avenue School when I was up there. She was the Special Services Secretary. And I can remember where Tobias Morgan's photography place was up near the corner of Fairview Avenue. When I was a small youngster, we used to live on Pine Street at the time, and my mother used to pull my brother, I'm a twin, we used to pull my brother and I down the street in a wagon, and it used to be an American store, and she used to do a lot of shopping there. And then, of course, we would walk home because all the groceries would be in the wagon unless there wasn't that many, and then the two of us would sit and hold the groceries in our lap. Also during the Second War, the city home was an army camp at that time. And I think Louise can remember also, I used to see soldiers march down Fairview Avenue and then back. And that was one of the things I remember about the Second World War. Not to mention the rationing. You had rationing booklets, and if you used those booklets up, you couldn't buy anything. I remember when the war was over in 1945, my brother and I were 7 years old, and my aunt walked us down to the corner of Fairview Avenue, and I can remember the kids were celebrating, they were banging pots and pans, and that I can remember about the war. I can't remember a heck of a lot more about it, except that I can remember they had gas rationing, and you only got 3 gallons a week. And my aunt and uncle lived in Middletown, New York, and the only way we could get to Middletown was to take a bus to Patterson and take the Erie Railroad to Middletown. And that was the only way you could travel those distances.
Well, going back to the Army being over at the city home field, which is now the high school, where was I? I was out in the athletic field out in back here. I was in high school at the time. It was an anti-aircraft battalion there that was doing their training, and they had Piper Cubs flying around, and all of a sudden we're watching one circle and crash into a house on
Linden Avenue. I remember that.
Between Grove and Fairview.
Yeah.
And the Navy was there at one time, and the remembrance I have of that was, it was the middle of the night, and I could hear marching coming down the street, and the boys were all singing Anchors Away, and they were marching down Durrell Street to get onto a train that was taking them who knows where. It was on the siding at Bar's Lumberyard. But after the war was over, they put veterans barracks in. They did 3 sets of them. They did one set at the corner of Brookside and Linden.
Mm-hmm.
The other was next to the F.N. Brown School. And then they had the ones that they had on Durrell Street that were directly opposite me. I have a few pictures here if you want to zoom in on them.
Okay.
This was Durrell Street looking down towards Charles Boyle Lumberyard. As you can see, they were 2 families. So we had 5 barracks there, so there were 10 families there. And then this is a close-up of what one of the barracks looked like to give you an idea of how they lived. And it was very interesting living across the street from them at that time. I won't go into any details, but I got quite an education, let's put it that way. Now, this one. So other than that, where did we go?
Well, I can remember as a kid growing up on Pine Street. We lived there from about 1942 until 1951 when we moved into my great-grandmother's house on Sunnyside Place. And my great-grandfather was an undertaker, so there were a few interesting things like casket tops and things like that in that attic when we moved there. But while we were living on Pine Street, that was a great place to sleigh ride as a kid back in the 40s. You could sleigh ride from the top of Pine Street all the way down to Fairview Avenue. They only plowed them, they didn't salt, and there weren't, of course, as many cars around then, so it was great sleigh riding. There were a lot of empty lots around then. Parker's Place had 3 houses on it. And at that time, I didn't know that my wife, who I married in 1966, I did not know her aunt lived in one of those houses until I married my wife. And she said, well, my aunt lived on Parker's Place. And I said, oh, yeah, okay, I knew who your aunt was. Of course, we met her a number of times after that when we went to Maine. My father also had across the street, Parker's Place, on a lot between Mrs. Lazar's house and ours. Mrs. Lazar, by the way, owned the house that we lived in. My father had 2 chicken coops there, and he raised approximately 200 chickens, and he sold the eggs. And I think it was an easier time, more laid back time than it is today. Families were closer, and you didn't have as much hustle and bustle as you have now. And I think it was a little bit easier living back then.
We were young.